Hello, and welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. In today's world, we have technology seemingly changing almost as soon as you can go ahead and cough. In fact, if you were to blink your eye right now, guess what? A new piece of technology is coming onto the market, and all of a sudden, if it's the new and improved version, whatever it is you have, it's now obsolete. Just last year, we started thinking about iPhones and applications. Now we're discovering that you can have an iPhone that's almost the size of your palm. What kind of new ways of technology can occur? It's anyone's guess. But you know, the amazing thing is that we have to ask ourselves a key critical question. What is it that drives technology to change? Well, sometimes in peace, it's just necessity. But other times, it's war that creates the drive of technology. And so, many breakthroughs in military technology occurred during the Civil War, and Virginia witnessed many of these particular innovations. One of the biggest ones deals with the railroad industries. Most military thinkers of the 1850s rejected the railroads for any military use. Consequently, when war broke out in April of 1861, the U.S. Army had no organized plans for using railroads to aid the Union cause. However, Confederate Matthew Fontaine Maury had suggested 10 years before the war that railroads could be used to concentrate soldiers at desired points. And so, at the beginning of the Civil War, many Southerners believed that the massive size of the Confederacy made Union victory impossible. Stretching from the Potomac to the Rio Grande, the 11 states of the Confederacy formed a landmass the size of continental Europe. Although the Union had a substantial advantage in manpower, Confederates hoped that by capitalizing on their interior and therefore shorter lines of communication, they could maneuver soldiers from effectively fighting a war of superior mobility. Such a strategy relied on the strength of Southern railroads. In 1861, the Confederacy boasted a significant number of railroads but lacked an integrated rail system. Across the Southern landscape, branches of the burgeoning rail system stretched towards each other but did not yet reach. In April of 1861, most interstate roads were incomplete. Some lines, such as the Mobile and Great Northern Railroad that promised to link eastern and western rails across Alabama, were under construction. In other cases, local interests blocked connecting links. Fearing a loss of trade, North Carolina politicians had long prevented the construction of a railroad between Danville, Virginia, and Greensboro, North Carolina, a gap that left the South with only two east-to-west arteries. In April of 1861, there were only two east-west connections linking Richmond and the Mississippi River.
Well, the Union Army immediately took control of the railroads in Alexandria when they moved into Virginia in May 1861. And they began to gear up these facilities for the war. As you mentioned, they got a late start, but they started catching up pretty quickly. By 1862, there was a connection between Alexandria and Washington, and some 50,000 rail cars were hauled over this 7-mile stretch during the course of the war. Now, railroads in the 1860s were small-scale local enterprises, as you mentioned. And the Union Army wanted priority treatment, but railroad managers still had an obligation to maintain civilian traffic and make money. So in January 1862, the United States Congress authorized President Lincoln to seize control of the railroads and telegraphs and make them for military use. Operations were turned over to the new War Department agency called the U.S. Military Railroads. And a gentleman named Herman Haupt, once the chief engineer of the Pennsylvania Railroad, became the chief of construction and transportation in the Virginia Theater of Operations. He also eventually attained the rank of Brigadier General. Now, Brigadier General Herman Haupt revolutionized military transportation in the United States. And he was really one of the unsung heroes of the Civil War. His well-organized trains kept the Union Army supplied and carried thousands of Union wounded to hospitals as well as troops to the battlefield. A single stretch of the Orange and Alexandria Railroad connected the vast Union Army to the supply depots of Alexandria and Washington. And at various times, this single link came under fire by Confederate raiders who cut telegraph lines, tore up the railroad lines, destroyed bridges. Well, to keep the trains running was an enormous task, and it was essential for victory. So Howe first sent out wrecking crews and a construction train to repair damaged tracks and bridges. And behind this followed supplies of rations for the Army, heavily guarded with riflemen sitting on top of railroad cars. And he arranged to send surgeons to the front and bring back the wounded, and transported 1,000 volunteer nurses to the front. So you can see he was a very busy guy, a very well-organized guy, and it all went back to his pre-war experience as a civilian railroad expert.
And certainly having the civilian knowledge does play an important role in trying to understand how one can come up with methods in order to try to move troops, especially over rail lines, from one point to another. And much like in the situation of the North, the Confederacy relied upon the cooperation of local railroad managers and state governors to maintain existing roads. Problems quickly appeared as both soldiers and supplies languished for days in remote depots. Individual railroad companies resisted calls to supply engines, cars, and rails for military purposes out of fear that their equipment would be damaged or go unreturned. Attempts by government officials to commandeer supplies often ended in noncompliance. In September of 1861, Secretary of War for the Confederacy, Judith Benjamin, attempted to obtain engines and cars for beleaguered Tennesseans from the western Atlantic, but Georgia Governor Joseph E. Brown blocked the action, claiming it violated the sovereignty of his state. Benjamin, his powers unclear, conceded to Brown. As the strategic military value of railroads became increasingly clear, the tightening noose of the Union blockade limited the supplies needed for Southern roads. In order for the railroads to provide their important services, something needed to be done in order to guarantee their continued efficient operation. In March of 1862, William Porcher Miles of South Carolina introduced a railroad bill that promised to centralize the Southern railroads through the establishment of a railroad bureaucracy with adequate powers to enforce compliance with military objectives. The bill called for a military chief of transportation who would preside over a number of regional directors, each in charge of overseeing a portion of the Southern railroads. The bill was also required that all railroad officials be given military rank. Further, it mandated that through schedules be established for government freight and that provisions be made for the exchange of rolling stock. Rolling stock, for those who are not aware, are locomotives and cars, and those were found among Southern lines. Outraged representatives protested that the bill went too far. Desperate to have some part of the bill passed, congressmen who supported it made concessions that stripped the bill of its power. Slashed from 12 provisions to 1, the bill passed the House only to die in the Senate. Although Congress stood firm in its refusal to centralize railroad authority, the War Department exercised its energies in building connecting lines such as the Selma Meridian. Over these lines, the War Department exercised direct control and sought to establish railroad connections between multiple points across the South. The anticipated Danville-Greensboro connection, made all the more necessary by the vulnerability of the coastal Wilmington and Weldon to the Union raids, received $1 million in bonds from Congress in February of 1862. Though generous, the funds failed to secure either material or labor. Virginia passed a law requiring planters to provide slaves for labor, but North Carolina, with the bulk of the line, failed to follow suit. Even when labor could be found, rails were difficult to come by. The Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, which produced an endless variety of war material, did not have the machinery to manufacture a single rail. Only when Captain Edmund Myers, in charge of the Danville-Greensboro line, received permission to secure rails from 7 minor or defunct railroads did work proceed. And although Myers' skill did make the railroad open, it wouldn't be until May of 1864.
Well, although the Union got a jump, their reliance on railroads channeled their major advances along clearly defined routes, which was a big deficiency. During the first 3 years of the war, the Confederacies could easily predict where the Union advances would occur. And raids against the railroads were a common practice which would delay advances. Colonel John Singleton Mosby's raiders were a constant danger to the railroads. In October 1864, a number of Alexandria's prominent citizens, known to be Confederate sympathizers, were forced to ride military trains as hostages. Edgar Snowden, Jr., editor of the Alexandria Gazette, was one of these hostages, and the Gazette was forced to suspend publication from October to January, October 1864 to January 1865. In addition to this, explosive devices were planted in the road beds, and these posed a serious threat to the trains. Mines were often made out of artillery shells with percussion fuses, and they were buried in the roadways, and the mines would detonate when the trains would pass overheads. And the mines were especially dangerous because they lifted locomotives right off the tracks because they were so powerful. Now, some federal commanders threatened to deport all the local inhabitants or destroy their farms if any explosions occurred along the rail lines where these people lived. General Haupt, the railroad mastermind, fearing Confederate attacks on the major Union rail hub at Alexandria, actually built barricades across the streets in Alexandria that led to the wharves and to the machine shops. The Union supply depot in Alexandria was the high-value target in this area of Northern Virginia for the Confederates. The entire 12-block area around Duke Street was occupied by the military railroad system, and this was all surrounded by stockades and defensive positions. Now, the Confederates never actually raided Alexandria, but the disruption of the supply lines was constant, and the disappearance of couriers and the other types of raids made Union commanders so angry that finally General Grant ordered that when any of Mosby's men were caught, they were to be hung without trial. And in September 1864, Union forces executed 6 of Mosby's men based on Grant's orders. Well, Mosby turned around and ordered 7 Union prisoners, chosen by lot, to be executed in retaliation. Mosby then requested that Union commanders resume treating prisoners with humanity. The Union side agreed, and there were no more executions on either side.
It's probably a good thing, considering that the Union had more men and could have easily just knocked out the Confederacy so quickly. And so, a lot of things end up changing during the war. And one of the things that ends up happening is that sometimes you need to create new departments. And in the case of the Confederacy, new departments will always seemingly be created at all time. And so for the Provisional Congress of the Confederate States of America, one of the things they had to create within their government very early on would be, everything. You name it, it has to be created. A State Department, a War Department, any kind of departments you can come up with, it needs to be there. And so 1861 would go ahead and be a very productive year for the new nation. Now, one big area that had to be created, of course, was the Naval Department. And so in looking at the Naval Department, 2.5 months in May of 1861, the former United States Senator from Florida, Stephen R. Mallory, was confirmed as the first Secretary of the Navy for the Confederacy. And so Mallory faced a very daunting task. His new Navy, which only existed in a theoretical sense, was responsible for defending 3,500 miles of southern coastline. Now, Mallory had also had to devise a means of breaking the Union blockade of southern ports and create a fleet of ships capable of threatening United States maritime commerce on the high seas. To accomplish this mission, Mallory had a fleet of 10 vessels made up of captured or abandoned United States naval vessels, revenue cutters, and other miscellaneous ships. The creation of the Confederate Navy came at a high point in the development of naval architecture and gunnery. The 1850s had seen the rapid development of steam-powered, screw-propelled iron ships, development that gave the Confederacy the technological potential to build the most modern naval fleet in the world. Stephen Mallory was well aware of the recent advances in warship design. After his election to the Senate in 1851, he had served as a member of the Committee on Naval Affairs, and since 1855, he had been its chairman. Mallory had overseen much of the work that had expanded and modernized the United States Navy and had monitored the advances made by European navies. Unfortunately, Mallory realized that the new Confederate nation lacked the materials, money, facilities, and time to build such a navy from scratch. Mallory recommended to the Congress that agents be sent to Europe to purchase ships and supplies for the new Confederate Navy. He also recommended the Navy develop a fleet of ironclad vessels to break the Union blockade. On May 10, 1861, the Confederate Congress appropriated $2 million to purchase ironclads in Europe. With considerable confidence, Mallory dispatched Lieutenant James North to France with orders to buy the French ironclad Glory, or, if that proved impossible, to contract for the construction of similar ships. Though Lieutenant North did travel to France, he failed to purchase any ships. Mallory then realized that if the South was to have an ironclad, she would have to build one herself. In the summer of 1861, Mallory met with Lieutenant John Brooke in Richmond, Virginia. A career naval officer in the United States Navy prior to the secession of Virginia, Brooke was now in the Confederate service. Mallory asked Brooke to begin working on a plan outlining the feasibility of constructing an ironclad warship. Brooke quickly drafted a design for a seagoing ironclad battery featuring a raised armored casement mounting guns in conventional broadside configuration. Now, the casement was to be mounted upon a ship's hull with an extended deck on the bow and stern. Mallory quickly approved Brooke's design and appointed a naval constructor to oversee its construction. Finding no engines available, Brooke suggested salvaging the machinery from the wreck of the USS Merrimac. Though the former the United States frigate had been partially burned and sunk by the U.S. Navy, her lower hull and power plant had been salvaged by the Confederates. In July of 1861, the Confederate Congress appropriated the expenditure of $170,000 to begin the conversion. After 9 months of construction, the completed Confederate ironclad, christened the CSS Virginia, was a formidable warship. Her overall length was 270 feet. The entire hull was designed to be submerged below the waterline, while the armored casement remained visible. The armored casement was protected by 24 inches of oak and pine, clad on the outside with 4 inches of iron plate. Her armament was made up of 10 guns, 3 9-inch smooth-bore Dahlgrens, and 1 6-inch rifle lined each of her broadside, and a single pivot-mounted 7-inch Brooke rifle was set in the stern and bow gun ports. The Virginia was also fitted with a 1,500-pound iron ram affixed to her bow, enabling her to crush the hulls of opposing ships. Though Virginia, at the time of her launching, was undoubtedly the most formidable ship in the Hampton Roads, her design and construction had flaws that would inhibit her effectiveness as a warship. Foremost in her deficiencies was the steam power plant. The Virginia was powered by the engines that had been salvaged from the Merrimac. These engines had been condemned by the U.S. Navy in 1860, and the submersion of the engines in the Elizabeth River for several weeks had not improved them. Her steering was also extremely sluggish. She required nearly 40 minutes to execute a full turn. The Virginia's slow handling was particularly problematic since her guns were mounted on stationary broadsides. This meant that it was necessary to maneuver the ship to bring her guns to bear on a target. Nevertheless, for all her design flaws, the Virginia served as the prototype for nearly all 22 Confederate ironclads built during this war.
Well, ironclads weren't the only breakthrough. Professor Thaddeus Lowe believed in the military value of hot air balloons. On June 1861, he conducted a hot air balloon experiment for President Lincoln. He ascended above Washington, D.C. in a balloon with a telegraphic keying device on board and the telegraphic wire hanging out of the balloon to the ground. He succeeded that day in transmitting the first air-to-ground telegraphic communication. Now, Professor Lowe is also credited with taking the first aerial photograph, again from one of his balloons. These successes so impressed President Lincoln as to the potential of balloons that he made Professor Lowe the head of the Union Balloon Corps. The Union found that while the balloons did give scouts a real advantage, there were some problems. Not only were they regularly shot down as they ascended or descended, but the balloons tended to spin in the air, making the scout on board very sick. The Union Balloon Corps was officially disbanded in May of 1863. Well, the Confederacy, not to be outdone, was envious of the Union efforts in the area of ballooning and made an attempt to enter the game. The effort is best described in the words of General James Longstreet. He said, "While we were longing for the balloons that poverty denied us, a genius arose and suggested that we gather silk dresses and make a balloon. It was done, and we soon had a great patchwork ship. One day it was on a steamer down on the James River when the tide went out and left the vessel and balloon high and dry on a bar. The Federals gathered it in, and with it the last silk dresses in the Confederacy. The patchwork silk was given to Professor Lowe, who had no use for it. He had it cut up and distributed to members of the U.S. Congress as souvenirs."
Hey, now the threat of terrorism is nothing new in American history. In 1864, the 814,000 people of New York City faced a terrorist threat by Confederate agents angered over the Union Army's ravaging of Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. The plot was formulated by Robert Martin, a Confederate officer who had once served under the famous Confederate raider John Hunt Morgan. Now, Martin, with 6 others, planned to set fire to large hotels on Election Day, which was November the 8th, 1864, while Southern sympathizers would simultaneously begin uprising similar to the draft riots of 1863, among the large teeming immigrant population living in poverty around the slums of Five Points. The draft riots of July of 63 shut the city down for 3 days as rioters burned, looted, and killed. Union troops marched straight from the battlefield at Gettysburg to put down the riot. Some 118 people died. Missing their target date by 2 weeks, the terrorists struck on November 25, 1864. Planes sent New York ablaze with an incendiary mixture of sulfur, naphtha, and quicklime that burst into flame when exposed to air. Over a dozen buildings were set on fire in a 4-hour period. The incendiary mixture did not perform as predicted, and all the fires were quickly extinguished. New Yorkers were outraged by the attack. Frank Leslie's Illustrated newspaper called it, quote, "the most diabolical attempt at arson and murder of which there is any record in the history of our country." The New York Times called the plot one of the most fiendish and inhuman acts known to modern times. None of the Southern agents were ever apprehended, and so as such, they were able to get away with their crimes. But you know, when you think about military technology, one of the amazing things that comes up is that everybody wanted to get a piece into this puzzle. They wanted to go ahead and create their military technology, but so much of it is a dud. And so we're really lucky in a lot of ways. For instance, some people would come up with plans of creating a shirt which could repel a bullet. Now, if you're in the War Department and you've just been presented that, are you going to test it out?
No.
Well, would you have the inventor?
You could put it on a cow or something.
You could certainly try to put it on a cow or an animal, and let's find out if it's bulletproof. And amazingly enough, this is something that the War Department in the Civil War had to deal with on many occasions. There was no such thing as a safe bet this is going to work. In fact, a good example of this comes from the book called Love and War by John Jakes. And in it, one of his primary characters, a gentleman by the name of George Hazard, works in the War Department, and he's working specifically on this acquisition department, wherein you try to go ahead and buy war materials that are better for the Army. Well, one of them is that guy with a shirt that says it's bulletproof. Now, after hearing so many of these particular claims, Hazard had a very simple way of testing it out. He pulled out a pistol, told the inventor to put the shirt on, and he'll shoot him. Very quickly, the inventor was gone.
I see.
But you know, it's amazing to think about all these particular inventions that could have worked, mostly didn't, but they're still there.
Well, one invention that the Confederates used was an early form of microfiche. They had tiny writing, and they used this in their spying, and they would send it back from Europe, and then when it arrived back in the Confederacy, it was held up to the light, and people could read it. So it was one of the earliest forms of microfiche.
Well, certainly the Civil War has a lot of technology in it. And as such, it's amazing to think that a lot of these technological advances would not have occurred unless we had to go to war. And so to learn more about Civil War technology and the way in which this would create predecessors to the things we have today, please visit us at our website, www.timetravel21.com, or email us at timetravel21@yahoo.com.